We'll do about 2 more minutes to let the last few people get logged on here. I'm going through and making sure that you're promoted to have the permissions that you asked for when you registered. And then we'll be getting started with Josh here in just about 2 more minutes. All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Jennifer LeMay. We are here today to listen to Josh Montanari talk about President Carter and the energy crisis. I appreciate you guys logging in today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and go through a few housekeeping items here. So again, the title of our program today is Planning for the Future, President Carter and the Energy Crisis. And this is being presented to us by the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. Our program today is made possible through a partnership between Internet2, the National Park Service, and the National Archives. We're hoping to keep today's presentation to approximately 45 minutes. If at any point you need to log off due to time constraints, please feel free to do so. But after he wraps up at about 45-minute mark, we will be able to open up for a little bit more question and answer, and stick around if you have further inquiries for Josh. A quick disclaimer: by participating in this distance learning session, participants agree to be videotaped, streamed, broadcast, and archived as a part of the program series. Recordings of all PPSP sessions will be posted and available on the Internet2 YouTube page. In order to better facilitate the presenter classroom interaction, we want to review a few expectations. If you're a student that's participating via video in a classroom, teachers, please have your students who want to interact come forward and speak into the microphone if they'd like to answer or ask a question. For students who are participating via the audio, again, make sure that you're close to your microphone so we can hear you, and you can use the raise hand icon in order to let us know that you have some input or you'd like to answer or ask a question. For the students who are participating via the chat box, that's going to be the icon that looks like a caption bubble. You can use that to answer and to ask questions throughout the presentation. And for all students, please take advantage of the fantastic opportunity to interact with our presenters and your fellow students. We're excited to have you here, and we want to hear your thoughts and questions. Please be respectful of the chat box and the interactive tools. We want to be able to address as many thoughts and questions as we can, so please only use these tools to respond directly to presenter prompts. If there is any inappropriate or distracting conduct over video, audio, or the chat box, we will remove you from the program. If you'd like more information about PPSP or to access the video archives or information about future programs, please visit our website, which is displayed on the screen, internet2.edu/PPSP. With that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and I'm going to pass it over to Josh, who's going to share his expertise with us. Go ahead, Josh.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you for being here to moderate with us today. Let me just get my slideshow going. So our program today is Planning for the Future, President Carter and the Energy Crisis. And this is a topic that's a new one for me to present. Typically, I do a lot of Camp David programs here at the Carter Library and museum tours before the reality we're all in right now. So I thought it was about time that I had a program on this, and I thought today being February 2nd, the anniversary of his fireside chat on energy was an appropriate time to do it. And what I've discovered in writing this program is that it has a lot of legs, and it's very hard to isolate it from other topics of the Carter presidency. Like the John Muir quote you see there, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find a hitch to everything else in the universe. I feel like that's what it was like writing this program about the energy crisis. And so I'm doing my best to kind of put it in those contexts within the confines of the time we have together today. But I do encourage teachers to perhaps make this part of a larger unit that does give proper attention to all these topics. And throughout this presentation, which will be made available to you after today, you'll see hyperlinks to other things so you have some more inquiry, you can go into more detail, see additional primary sources as well. So please take the time to go back through this after today. So here's an outline of what we're going to be discussing. Really, how did we get here? What was President Carter's response? And what are the civics connections between us and this event? How does it relate to our lives now? So the circumstances of the energy crisis, if we really want to boil this down, huge supply and demand after the Second World War, and also the foreign policy of the United States after the Second World War. You saw that Cold War was one of those things I had connected to the energy crisis that has a very big role to play. The Middle East peace process, I think we all would agree, has a very big role to play in energy in the United States. You'll see a link there for some more information from the National Archives about the Marshall Plan and some primary documents with that. Ties in with that United States foreign policy. So starting with the United States boom after World War II. You know, a thing to understand about that is most of the world was kind of on its back after the Second World War. So the United States was just growing at an exorbitant pace. Population 71%, gross domestic product up 508% in that 40-year period. So if the United States was a business, its business had grown more than 500%. And how did we do that? We did that significantly through heavy reliance on cheap fossil fuels, notably imported oil from the Middle East. We imported about 25% of the oil produced in the Middle East. And so here at home, what that translated to was about 40% of our energy coming from these sources overseas. And it seems that the American economy had gotten rather comfortable in this pattern that we had. So how do we connect the Cold War, a time when we saw posters like those on the left about nuclear holocaust possibly happening at any point from Soviet Union and vice versa from us over there? How do we connect that to this gentleman we see here at a gas station with no gas? Well, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in the Cold War by proxy and one of those theaters was the Arab-Israeli conflicts that began following the Second World War and had continued through the 1970s. The United States had recognized the state of Israel. The Soviet Union kind of played to Israel's Arab neighbors, and they were the Cold War influence there. The US naturally tries to counter that Soviet influence with their support of Israel through their numerous conflicts. The The last of those prior to Carter's time in office was in 73. And at the outcome of that, which was an Israeli victory, but a hard-fought one, the OPEC institutes an embargo on the United States. So the price of oil goes up 350%, basically overnight. Now we see a great primary source there showing one example of how this impacted daily life of the average American. Here's a moment we can go get into the chat and give our own perspectives. What other aspects of our lives do we think would have been impacted by that 350% rise in the cost of fuel? So let's hear from anybody here with us.
Tyler says going places, so our transportation would have been affected.
Right, and the day you could get gas, eventually they work it out to where whatever your number, your license plate ends in, if it's odd or even, what day you can get gas. So I think that's something we take for granted, having to stop and think about that before you leave the house, just to get your fuel to go to work, wherever you're going. I mean, is it limited to just gasoline in our personal cars?
The Brown School mentioned vacations, and Farmington Falls says that not everyone would be able to afford movement.
Right. Okay, so maybe let's segue to that second question. What industries, so aside from the average American, what industries, and we're speaking generally here, do you think would have been most affected? Think of what things need fuel to run that we have in our lives besides just getting in a car that's fueled.
So Tyler and Farmington Falls both mentioned like lawnmowers and other appliances like that around the home that were powered by gas. Brown School talked about factories.
Right there. So actually both those are really good answers. Think about, I mean, lawnmowers specifically. Think about how many people in America, suburbia, like the picture we saw a slide or two ago. People, it's their pride and joy keeping that lawn run, and all of a sudden they're out of fuel to run that lawnmower. Or could have been a big deal back then. I wasn't alive when this was happening. Maybe that was a huge part of it. That's a cool perspective, Tyler. Factories, right? Factories are going to run on fuel to build and manufacture the things that we're buying or the services. How, I mean, we have personal vehicles. How do those goods they're manufacturing get to the vendors in the market? Right? That's trucks or ships. Ships are also running on fuel, whether it's regular gasoline, diesel, all of it's refined from oil. Right? So it really seems like none of us could have been untouched by this. Maybe like the pandemic we're all experiencing now, something that's touched everybody. That's kind of what this was like back then. We woke up one day and realized, oh my gosh, our way of life is about to be on empty. Now, how do you think, just off the top of your head, nothing too technical here, how do you think we discourage people from using something? I know an example that I used in the first program that I've seen rise dramatically in my life, the price of tobacco products. What have we done to tobacco products? Why does the price rise? Is it the tobacco companies getting all that money in the rise in price?
Farmington Falls said maybe an added tax, and Tyler asked possible embargoes.
Mm-hmm. Right. That seems to be a traditional way of doing that. Where I grew up in Maryland, I believe right after I moved away as a young man, there was what was called a runoff tax because of pollution in the Chesapeake Bay. Maryland determined a tax on the impermeable surface or asphalt that you had on your property. So that was a tax to discourage people from having landscapes on their homes that couldn't absorb water, that things that encouraged more pollution to enter the bay. That's one example I remember from being young. So that's really what the government did. We put a tax on oil profits, which was then passed on at the pump. So we do see traditionally when things like that happen, demand goes down. Any other examples? No, that's totally fine. If we don't have any right now, we can move along. But that is a segue into how the government approached this. And think of this right now as if you're in math class, students got to do their steps. Even if you know the square root of 16 is 4, there's going to be some kind of work you got to show. I like to think in civics, we want to show our steps. So that's what this is, going over the Constitution. The National Archives is the custodian of that document. So we pride ourselves on making folks aware of what it is and how it affects our lives. So we have the option of congressional legislation. That's Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution. Anything passed by Congress, always subject to approval or veto by the president, an example of checks and balances in our government. So one branch isn't calling the shots. Speaking of that, there's executive action. That's where it seems that the executive branch is calling the shots. And Article 2, Section 1, basically powers not relegated to the judicial or legislative, nor explicitly denied to the executive. So that's pretty broad. We had a lot of executive orders in recent years. The last administration, Trump administration, a lot of executive orders. Naturally, a new administration takes over, more flurry of executive orders. But I don't think folks understand the weight that they carry. They don't really have binding weight. We'll talk about that in a moment, but they can still be powerfully symbolic as symbols and gestures. Diplomacy. That's another topic we'll be talking about, how the Carter administration approached this problem, and basically how any president, any administration would be able to approach this problem. And that's Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, where the president gets to choose who our ambassadors to other nations will be. They receive ambassadors and leaders from other nations themselves. And then the power to make treaties with foreign governments. This is another example of checks and balances in our system where the president can make a treaty, but it's subject to the approval of the United States Senate. And not just simple majority, but a 2/3 majority, which is 66 out of 100 senators. Now, as far as congressional legislation goes, these are 4 notable ones that were passed during the Carter administration in response to the energy crisis. Again, 2 branches of government working together here. The Emergency Natural Gas Act of 1977, just kind of summarize that. We have reserves of natural gas for a rainy day. The president thought it expedient that we release some of those reserves to help stabilize the market and satisfy demand. So that is signed, and all these have links to them with more detailed information, by the way. The Department of Energy Organization Act, anytime a new agency in the government is created, it's the blank Organization Act. This was for a cabinet level agency. The most recent time that was done in our history was by George W. Bush in response to 9/11, when he created the Department of Homeland Security. And that was out of existing intelligence and security agencies. The Department of Energy, same story. We had many different federal agencies who were working in the area of energy. Those were consolidated under this one new agency. And there we see a primary source photograph of President Carter witnessing the swearing in of the first ever Secretary of the Energy. This is also the person who oversees our nuclear weapons arsenal as well. So don't think of that as just about electricity and natural gas and coal and things like that. There's also some really important national security stuff at stake in this person's office. We then have the National Energy Act. So that really gives our nation an energy plan for the first time. What does that mean? It means we actually started looking at how we use our energy, where we get it from, how we're going to use it, where we're going to get it from, those things. We never had that until 1978. And then we have the Energy Security Act building on the National Energy Act. Now we mentioned executive action. So here is a list of executive orders that were issued by Jimmy Carter during his one term in office in regards to energy. And you'll see I have a brief description of each of those. Now, I was speaking about the weight that an executive order carries. So executive orders, as we mentioned, cannot supersede the role of the legislative branch, of the judicial branch. Typically, executive orders are augmenting already existing legislation. So let's say something like the Emergency Natural Gas Act is passed. It might not have a specific direction when a part of it has to be implemented by, or who exactly is assigned a role. An executive order might clarify that, might provide a deadline, might establish a task force. This morning, I saw a headline that President Biden just issued an executive order forming a task force to try to reunite families that have been separated at the border. Now, that's a task force on trying to find those folks, but there's not a law that says this has to happen by a certain date and time, this and that. So that's just a very current example of what an executive order is. So Carter is using that vague gray area to try to speed along implementation of the response to this crisis. That's more or less what this is doing, is bringing clarity to those big picture solutions that he and Congress came to an agreement over. Now, Carter engages directly with the American people in an appeal to gain cooperation and assistance in combating the energy crisis. He reverts to fireside chats, such as those employed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in another crisis that we had, which was the Great Depression, which then segued into the Second World War. He used that pulpit quite often and quite effectively. So Carter tries to do the same. He tells folks, we're turning down the thermostat at the White House, 10 degrees, we're all putting on sweaters. You should put on a sweater too, do your part. And that has mixed reviews with Americans, understandably. It does sound like a very reasonable response. But then again, so a lot of folks see it as condescending. The term preachy is used quite often in folks' responses to President Carter's personal appeals, almost like talking down to folks that they should know the right thing to do and they just need to do it. But nonetheless, Jimmy Carter did try various avenues. Pop culture, we see a comic book from Marvel and the Department of Energy with Captain America, Battle of the Energy Drainers. In fact, in tandem with that, Rosalind Carter and Amy Carter hosted Stan Lee and some Marvel characters in costume at the White House for an event to help promote the establishment of the Department of Energy and National Energy Education Day that Carter also established. He was a personal enthusiast of solar panels and their potential in the American energy landscape. He has some installed on the roof of the White House. Now, these did not power everything in the White House and the West Wing. They were just a supplement to the existing energy sources that they had. But nonetheless, when you see a president doing something, it can have a big impact. And he did try to lead by example. Wind turbines, ethanol. In case you're wondering what ethanol, if we have any students with us, I never really understood what this was all about. But when you pull up to a gas station and go to a pump, you will see on the gas pump, and most stations, may contain up to 10% ethanol. And that was something that we can derive from corn. It's an additive that you could say stretches fuel further. Not necessarily gives you better mileage, but stretches the fuel further to need less oil in the refining process. So that was a big program Carter had. Oddly enough, these days we hear we want to get away from coal. The industry is waning. We know President Trump did make some efforts through executive orders to try to shore up the coal industry to help people struggling on those parts of the country where that's was a big employer. But Carter's really going with an above all approach. He's not really taking any options off the table. He's looking at all domestic energy sources at that time, and he does promote coal because it is coal that we burn to generate electricity in our country. For the most part, that is the primary source of electricity is coal. Natural gas, we'll talk about some agreements with other countries when we get into diplomacy, and nuclear power. Now, nuclear power comes into our lives as a very destructive force. When the United States drops those nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II, but we then begin harnessing it for energy, for peaceful purposes. So President Carter is a big proponent of nuclear power. It has zero emissions. However, there are definitely some things you have to deal with as far as the cleanup of that goes. But Jimmy Carter does have a history in nuclear energy, in case folks aren't aware. He studies reactor technologies and nuclear physics when he's in submarine school during his time with the United States Navy. He's still our only president to have completed submarine school. He goes on to serve on only the second nuclear-powered submarine in our nation's history. He would assist in the design and development of nuclear power plants or engines for naval vessels. So he's basically like the mechanic for a nuclear-powered submarine. And he leads the first nuclear meltdown response team in world history that occurred in Canada. And it was said that he and his team absorbed the acceptable amount of radiation for an entire year in their in the first 90 seconds. They responded to this. So Carter really was a benchmark in the study of how we respond to nuclear emergencies, such as that. I like to joke that with folks when I'm giving tours that maybe that's why Carter's still able to work for Habitat for Humanity and beat brain cancer in his 90s as a result of his experience in that meltdown cleanup. Sounds like a great comic book origin story. But so he's definitely familiar with nuclear technology. He understands how it works and he knows the potential. So he has a vision that this will be a big proponent, that this might be the thing that replaces our dependence on foreign oil. And we won't be at the whims of things that are happening in that region of the world. And so diplomacy also becomes a big part of his fight in the energy crisis. And what do I mean by that? We mentioned those Cold War connections with Arab and Israeli conflicts. Maybe if he can get them to stop those wars, which seem to happen every few years for the last 4 decades, and then put our energy supply in jeopardy, maybe this will be a thing of the past. We see a very personal letter here that he wrote to Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, imploring him to help him move forward with this peace agreement with the nation of Israel. And Jimmy Carter was a very personal president. When you think of any president and the staff they have at their disposal, Jimmy Carter often writes handwritten letters to other world leaders, just like this. And even just looking at the closing there, here's the leader of the free world telling the president of Egypt, this is a personal appeal for your support. I need you, basically. I'm in your debt at this moment. You know, and my very best wishes to you and your family, and not sincerely, respectfully, but your friend, Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter, you know, he's building on the work of his predecessors, Gerald Ford, Richard Nixon, both of them had been courting Anwar Sadat to bring them more or less to the US western side of the Cold War. And he's really building, and he seized the moment to seize it once and for all. So that's what I think that primary source and other written correspondence we had between Carter, Anwar Sadat, Menachem Begin really provides strong evidence of. Now, aside from the Middle East peace process, I mentioned foreign agreements, again, just showing our steps. This is civics algebra here, that we made agreements with Canada to help transport natural gas across the border. We made agreements with Mexico to transport natural gas across their borders. So diplomacy is definitely involved in these. Nothing too exciting there, just mundane foreign agreements, but nonetheless, steps Carter had to take in this crisis. And then just to build a little bit more on the Camp David Accords, again, that was 4 decades of war, normalized diplomatic relations. I think students should really understand the weight that carries. For instance, I've heard Jimmy Carter, when I was in an audience with him, say the greatest thing he did as president was normalizing diplomatic relations between the US and China. So that means two countries are speaking openly to each other. Not like United States and North Korea, where we saw President Trump making some personal appeals and meetings, but we do not have an embassy in North Korea. North Korea does not have an embassy in the United States. All we know about them is what we gain through covert intelligence and information from other nations who might have intelligence. So for Israel and Egypt to have that open relationship was huge, because it had been Egypt who was spearheading much of the conflict, at least the Arab side of that conflict with Israel. So now that's been neutralized. Israel returns Sinai Peninsula. That builds more trust between the two. And what it does is it takes the Soviet Union out of the ballgame in Egypt. Egypt really becomes a solid US Western ally that continues for decades after. And basically Carter at this point thinks he's sewn up that side of things in the Middle East. We don't have to worry about a war breaking out that's going to strain our oil supply, or there's going to be an embargo put on us where we see these 300% increases. That is a thing of the past. Now, throughout all of this, again, his predecessors and President Carter, they're dealing with the environmental movement. Again, that population boom. Think of all those suburbias, like that picture we saw popping up all over the nation. And then all of the industry going along to provide us the things that we use in our daily lives. It's when we get to the 1950s and 60s, we start to notice things, deteriorating air quality. We're seeing things like asthma get exacerbated in people, litter, debris. I believe I saw one photograph in the National Archives where you could literally see raw sewage from an aerial view pouring into the Hudson River. Just nothing between your toilet and the Hudson River, where we're fishing and crabbing and all of that stuff. Or like in the photo we see here, in the state of Washington, children literally playing under a stack that's shooting arsenic and lead on them. So this is something that's ongoing through all of this, on top of all of those other things. And a big response that we had was President Nixon when he creates or signs into law the Environmental Protection Agency. So much like Jimmy Carter gave us our first energy plan, Nixon gives us our first government agency who's actually paying attention to what's going on in our environment, and gives us actual tangible guidelines and rules to follow. And they're given the weight of enforcement from the law. So the judicial branch has agreed this can go forward, and this agency can tell businesses what they can and can't put into the environment. So that is that's a landmark piece of legislation right there in combating that crisis. Then when we have Jimmy Carter promoting all of this nuclear energy, and it really is the wave of the future, no emissions. It's not like that coal. You don't have to burn it to get electricity. It's not like that oil. We have to have diplomacy to make sure it's available. We can build this anywhere. This can power everything. Then the 3 Mile Island disaster strikes. 3 Mile Island, you've seen aerial shot. You can imagine how it got its name, sits on the Susquehanna River, very close to the state capital of Pennsylvania, Harrisburg. Why is it a big deal if something goes wrong at this site, not just that immediate area? It's on the Susquehanna River, which is the tributary of the Chesapeake Bay, which is in a very densely populated part of the country, Baltimore City, Washington, D.C., Virginia, a lot of people there this could affect. So what happens is we see one of the reactors beginning to have a partial meltdown. And you can imagine, folks here, this is a relatively new industry here. Folks have not been through these experiences. They've had training, but they haven't been through the experience. And there was some human error in the response, underestimating what was happening, and it exacerbated it. But it literally comes within an hour of complete meltdown. So think, if you know anything about Chernobyl, the Russian meltdown that happened, this would have been Chernobyl. We came within an hour. but we did rectify it. It did not go back online for another 6 years in 1985. And believe it or not, it actually kept producing until just a couple years ago. If you're ever traveling in Pennsylvania, if you drive up I-83 from Harrisburg, you can see 3 Mile Island to your right down the Susquehanna River. So because of this near collapse, there goes that response to this crisis. This was like the ace in our pocket for that, and now it's gone. And so we have yet to build a new nuclear power plant since 3 Mile Island happened. In fact, what do we hear of? We only hear of them closing now. We don't hear of new ones going up. But nonetheless, just to give you an idea of the impetus this had, it still supplies 20% of our energy 40 years later when we stopped building them. So it was a big part of this. So that's a pretty big blow. And we don't even want to look at this as Jimmy Carter's effort, but just our nation's effort to combat this crisis. And one more crisis on top of the many was the Iranian Revolution, which then leads to the hostage crisis in Iran, which comes to consume the Carter presidency. There's a quote on our museum wall in Atlanta here that there were 2 White Houses from 1979 on, the one dealing with the Iran hostage crisis, the one dealing with everything else we were experiencing. And just again, to really generally summarize this, the pro-American Shah, who was the head of state of Iran, flees when there is this revolution, seeks medical treatment in the US. That is what triggers the hostage crisis to occur. They demand the return of the Shah to stand trial. So they take 52 Americans hostage for 444 days. And during that time, Iran nationalizes its oil. And for anyone who doesn't understand what that means, no companies have oil. Now it's the state of Iran, the country of Iran owns all the oil. The government owns all of it. And what did they do? They turned off the faucet. Kind of like the embargo, they just stopped producing oil. And when you look at this line chart here from the US Energy Information Administration, that big spike you see above 1980, which is 79, that's what happens. When we thought we had it under control, back up it goes. So again, another blow to our nation's efforts to try to control the soaring prices of oil and the things that we get out of it. So in summary, and again, a concise summary, this could, I'm sure, be much more broad within our confines. What do we get out of the Carter administration's response? Well, we do get that first comprehensive energy plan in our nation's history. And that's something we're still doing today. So there's a literal connection to this response and current events. At that time, US imports of foreign oil drops 2 million barrels per day from the time Carter took office to when he goes out. So that was a big accomplishment then. When you do see a tangible result of that price of oil going up, of them discouraging people to use it to seek other energy means or to conserve, the American people did respond to that. We didn't get into it too much. I didn't want to go deep into economics with this, but stagflation, the combination of high inflation and high unemployment, that does continue because of the rising fuel costs. Again, everyone was touched by this crisis. And because of so many industries having those fuel costs go up, affecting their bottom line, we saw layoffs. And then when people don't have jobs, don't have money, they're not buying those products that are being manufactured. It's just a vicious cycle. And this does go into the Reagan administration after Carter. Reagan was very successful in getting inflation under control, but the unemployment was another issue from that. But that's a lesson for another day. Conservation and use of renewable energy is introduced into mainstream society. These were brand new ideas then. It did take a lot of traction. We're still struggling as a society, just my personal opinion, to have this mainstream. Even recycling. I mean, it's fairly commonplace today, but I think we all know it's not completely universal across our country, in different states, different localities tackle the problem in different ways, but we are all aware of these things, regardless of the fact that we're not at that completely renewable energy grid yet. And just so a couple questions, I think, again, kind of just minding our P's and Q's constitutionally speaking in regards to civics. I would have students reflect, how did the branches of government work when they were confronted with this crisis? Did it seem that did one branch of the government really take the lead and have to carry the weight of the others? Was there compromise? Were there checks and balances? I mean, me personally, I think we did see a lot of checks and balances, especially with congressionally passed legislation, few, if any, legal challenges to what was being done. But I think it's important to have the perspective of, how did our government behave? How did it work together? Did the Constitution function as it should when we were confronted with this crisis? And I think a deeper question to ask, and this might be something more at the high school level, but how would you define the relationship between our nation's domestic policies and its foreign policies? Can those exist independently of each other? I mean, the crisis we saw today, we see them very entwined, but I would just challenge folks to say, is there something that we can keep apart that's not affected by something happening in Europe or Asia, wherever it might be? Do we have examples to the contrary? I think it's an important perspective that students should contemplate when they look back at this event in history, because it has legs into our lives today. It might not be the energy crisis, it might be immigration, it might be education, it might be healthcare. Is there something affecting us overseas on any of those? So it's a way of training your perception, the lens you look through with issues today. So I highly encourage these mundane yet, I think, very important questions to be posed to our students. Now, I just wanted to show a couple more resources. I'm at the end of the presentation itself, and then we'll open this up to any questions that any folks might have. So these are just some resources. There are so many out there. I didn't want to have fine print on my PowerPoint slide, so I just grabbed a handful of them. The Record of Jimmy Carter. So this is something you can look through the lens of his administration's personal bias. This was them saying, this is what we think we accomplished in our 4 years of office. And energy is one of those major categories that they reflect on. So I think it's an effective perspective to hear what they thought they did. And maybe you can synthesize that with your own perception of what you think they did. Briefing material on National Energy Plan. I think that's a great insight into what President Carter was being told by the experts at that time. This is how to approach the problem. This is our options. So you can get into a little more detail there, maybe even just have a document analysis exercise around that, or what would you have done in this situation with this information being brought to you. We listed a lot of those executive orders. If you want to go back and see those in further detail, it's codification of proclamations and executive orders. The Carter Library has a great page on the Camp David Accords. We have a lot of great research resources, photographs, written documents. There was also a link earlier to CIA documents. These will also be on that page. Something I came across, just looking for pictures of life in America during the 70s to include. The Doc-America Photography Project was done by the National Archives. It's a Google Arts and Culture exhibit. We're seeing those more and more these days. This one was searching for the 70s. And I think a lot of it's photographs from different regions of the country. I found some that were very personal for me. There's a couple photos where I grew up in Dundalk, Maryland, just outside of Baltimore, of the marine terminals and the steel industry, which my family was involved in. I kind of had some strong responses when I saw those, but really some really great insights there. President Carter's fireside chat on energy, which occurred on this day 44 years ago, I think was the math I did the first program. And that's through C-SPAN. Another speech, Carter's Malay speech, and that's brought to you by the American Presidency Project. So those are some great resources. I mentioned primary document analysis exercises. The National Archives has some great tools for that. We have our own document analysis worksheets, both at the primary or novice level and then at the secondary level. I have a link there, but I think a great exercise for students is to just go back to this presentation, which is going to be provided to you after you leave here today. Go through and choose 2 different kinds of those sources, and then complete these analysis worksheets and see how those correlate to current events today. And with those analysis worksheets, you see it noted there. It's okay if you can't answer every question. So if you ever use these in the classroom, please make that clear to your students. In fact, tell them they shouldn't be able to answer every question on a document analysis worksheet, because that probably means your source isn't so good, because we shouldn't get sourced all of our information from one source. And that source should spur further inquiry that can fill in those questions that one source can't answer. So that's a cool thing I think students don't get to hear often. Don't answer every question. So let them know that. So that's what I've got right now. And if anybody else would like to ask me any questions, we have a few minutes to do that right now. So I open up the floor.
Thanks so much, Josh. Expertise. We have one question from Jada. She's wondering if you know about the current state of alternative energy sources at the White House. Are the solar panels still up? Are there other things that we have there?
So that's an interesting story. So when Ronald Reagan takes office at the White House, and this isn't me demonizing Ronald Reagan, he does remove the solar panels that Jimmy Carter put on there. Now hear me out. Ronald Reagan had a different approach to engaging the American public. I mentioned a lot of folks saw Jimmy Carter as preachy. He's that guy telling you eat your broccoli and like it. You know, doesn't fit all of America. So Ronald Reagan took those down as a gesture of everything's fine. We're not at this point yet. We don't need to convert everything. The solar energy, we're going to be okay. We got gas for your car, for your factory. It's going to be there. So it was a sign of reassurance to America, I think. And at the same time, I'm not also advocating taking down solar panels either. But I think that was the perspective that Ronald Reagan was coming from. So solar panels do return to the White House. Later on, I believe George W. Bush has solar panels put on the White House. Barack Obama expands on those. And those are still there today. They were not taken down by the Trump administration, so don't start that rumor. And something else you might find interesting, the Carter Library here in Atlanta, we had solar panels installed on our roof because we do share a facility also with the Carter Center, which had been headed by President Carter and Mrs. Carter. They've now handed the reins off to his grandson, Jason. But we have solar panels there. And you also might know that in Jimmy Carter's current hometown of Plains, Georgia, he permitted, I believe it's 4 acres of solar panels to be installed on land that he owned. And I believe it's providing about half of the electricity that the city of Plains uses. It's not the hugest town, but I think it's a strong symbolic gesture. And I think Jimmy Carter in that case, as often with his work with the Carter Center, gives students a strong message that just because you're not president anymore doesn't mean you still can't lead our nation. And so that's my little bragging plug about Jimmy Carter. That he is a good source for that. So yes, definitely still have solar panels on the White House.
Great.
Any other questions that we have?
You guys can stick your questions in the chat, or if you want to use the raise hand feature to ask a question via audio or video, I can call on you that way as well.
Yeah, either way that you're comfortable doing this. See, I saw a comment from Tyler. I think it was in regards to the price of oil going up in the 2000s. Yeah, the price of oil. I definitely remember that stuff getting really expensive. And when we had our conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, naturally we had some strain in the supply there. Also some inner workings of the markets, which that is not my field of expertise. I remember we were getting over $4 a gallon around what, 2007 or 8. In fact, I quit a second restaurant I had serving at a restaurant because I was driving about 25 miles to get there, and financial collapse had happened. I was literally losing money in the gas I was spending to get to that second job. So I just quit and I actually started saving money after that. And right now we're experiencing, again, very low prices again. And something I think should be made clear, folks, is that the price of gas, really presidents at the end of the day have almost zero control over what the price of gasoline is. Because I mean, you can point to an administration of either political party, and at some point gas is cheap for them. And at some point it gets expensive. It's really the market more than it is anything that the United States president does.
Great. It is we're at 48 minutes now, so if you do need to jump off due to time constraints, please feel free to do so. I appreciate you guys joining us. And again, thank you, Josh, for sharing your knowledge with us. We do have a few more questions here on the chat, so if you'd like to stick around for the rest of that, feel free. And if not, then you can jump off. We have some more questions about solar panels on the White House, wanting to know how many solar panels are there now, if you have that information, compared to, I guess, how big the White House is.
So I don't have that off the top of my head. So I'm just going to real quick hop in a Google bar here. Square feet of White House is 54,900 feet. That's pretty big. So I think an average person's house is somewhere between 1,500 and maybe 2,500 square feet. So the White House is pretty big, I think. And as far as solar panels on White House, that's probably going to be an official White House page, I think, where we would get that. So might end an address we will get that will probably end in whitehouse.gov. But let me see what I find, just doing a simple search. Okay, it's not so simple. But I don't have that exact answer, but it's doing a little bit more than in Jimmy Carter's day. When Jimmy Carter had them on the roof of the White House, I believe they only supplemented the water heaters of the White House. Now I imagine there's quite a few bathrooms and faucets and things like that. So it was probably no small task back in the 1970s. And I've seen one of these solar panels up close. We have one on exhibit in our museum. It's very tall. It's probably about 6.5 feet tall. It's at least a foot thick. Today we see solar panels that are almost like flat screen TVs on our roof. And I think the one panel we have is probably about a third of that size these days. But I do not have that exact answer. I do want to try to move on and look at some other questions we have. But if anybody, feel free to search that while we're speaking here. And if you find, okay, 32 solar panels currently from Farmington Falls. Okay, cool. That's good to know. Oh, 32 were installed by Carter. Okay. Yeah, I would like to know how many are currently there. Hey, that's a great follow-up exercise, a further inquiry. That's what it's all about. I'm glad I made you think of something else. Made my day.
All right, do you have any other questions for Josh before we hop off?
No? Okay.
All right, well then thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you, Josh, for teaching us, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Bye, everyone.
Okay, take care, guys. Stay safe.